Amen. Please be seated. Yes, thanks to Mitch for starting the service off while we were finishing the annual general meeting down at St. John's. Nice to have that kind of partnership between the two congregations. The gospel reading we have today, it strikes me there's almost like a little funny line in the middle of it where Nathaniel says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It reminds me of that kind of rivalry between the Red Sox and the Yankees. Can anything good come out of New York or Boston? But the readings we have today have as a theme, which kind of runs through three of them anyway, three of the scriptures that we have today. The call. We have the call of Samuel in the first one, and then the call or the engagement of the psalmist with God in the psalm, and then in the gospel reading we have both the call of Philip and of Nathaniel. And this is the week, Martin Luther King weekend. And when I think of Martin Luther King and his calling and his call to us, his dream that he laid forward in that famous speech of his, I kind of wonder if he was here today and saw what, even the news of the last month, with its wars that seem almost unending, with the enduring strain, to say the least, between police and black men, and the shooting in Paris, and the ongoing kind of religious tension around the world. I wonder whether what Martin Luther King would say, and whether he would ask, what happened to the dream? What happened to the dream? And in our psalm today, it's actually called a lament. That psalm they have different kinds of psalms in the book of Psalms, and this one is called a lament. Partially because the last 6 verses of this psalm focus on the adversaries and the adversities that surround the person who wrote this psalm. We don't know who wrote this psalm, but there's some kind of very difficult circumstances around about him. And yet, as he meditates on his relationship with God and his journey with God, he says in the first part of the psalm how deep that relationship has been through his life, how intimately God knows him. And it strikes me that at times we may also wonder about whether we have really followed God's call in our lives. Are we doing what God intended us to do? Are we connected with the people that God meant us to be connected with? And I always found it humorous. I think most of us, maybe as children, you have that feeling of maybe you're in the wrong family. Perhaps there was some kind of switch at the hospital. You should have gone home with somebody else. You don't know how you got into this family. So it's one more way of, are we in the right place that God set us to be? And this week, today, in fact, is the beginning of the week of prayer for Christian unity. And even that sometimes seems like a cruel joke, because it seems as if Christianity is enduringly far from any kind of unity, even though we pray for it every year. So where is God's call? There's that little line in the first reading from the book of Samuel where it says, the word of the Lord was rare. The word of the Lord was rare. And sometimes we may feel that in our own life. How am I hearing God's word? When did I hear it? Am I still following where God is calling me? And it seems to be like on a kind of dial. Some people, and I think, if you don't mind me saying, Nancy and Ken, like, you met each other in high school, right? Yeah, some people, it's perfect, isn't it? You meet in high school, you get married, you have this great marriage that goes on forever. And some people know what they're meant to do when they're 12 years old, and they go to college and they get through it first time, start working, and have a great time at it, big success, and even when they're 80, they still enjoy doing it. So that's one end of the dial. And the other end of the dial is people who feel like they never did anything right in their life. Every single thing that they did always seemed to go in the wrong direction. Every relationship seemed to get messed up. I suppose I could think of somebody who was perhaps trafficked or a slave of some kind, or perhaps who was in life imprisonment, might say something like that nothing in their life, would they say, has been following what God's call to them was. And the rest of us are kind of somewhere in the middle. Some of the things we do think God did call us to do this, and some of the things we have our doubts about. So these readings that we have today are interesting from that point of view. What is God's call to us? And I don't think there's a very simple answer to that. What is God's call to us? I think it takes time, for example, to really learn what does God's voice sound like. What does God's leading feel like when God is leading us to do something? It's not always very obvious. But there's 4 or 5 things from these readings that I think do sort of emerge as elements of finding God's call to us. One is that there's an inner journey. We have Samuel spends the night, sleeps in the temple, and then he begins to hear this voice towards daybreak. So there's a kind of something like a sort of retreat or element of meditation or quiet there. That's also in the psalm. That person is meditating, dwelling on God's relationship and engagement with him. It's also there in the gospel reading, because you have Nathanael under the fig tree, which may be a symbol. Israel is usually symbolized by the fig tree. So it may be that he is meditating kind of on the history of Israel, on God's journey with the people of Israel. So there's, first of all, I think it's true that to hear God's call to us, the role of a retreat or of meditation or of a daily quiet time, something like that, a time apart with God, has something to do with hearing God's call to us. And then there is an encounter with God there in some way. And as I said, it takes time to learn that. If you look at little Samuel, probably only 5 or 6, he didn't know what was that voice that he was hearing. He kept going back to Eli to say, why are you calling me? Until Eli realized it was God. So there's Samuel beginning to learn what God's voice sounds like to him. And that beautiful line that I think is something we can all carry, speak, for your servant is listening. May that be true of us. Speak, for your servant is listening. Let us be people who listen to God. And then it's a continuing journey. So we have little Samuel, let's say he's 5 or 6 in this scene, and he goes on to be a judge of Israel. And still, as he goes along, remember Samuel was the one who chose out David. But when he was looking at all the sons of David, it was still kind of some uncertainty. So even at that point of his life, it wasn't as if God's voice was crystal clear, but eventually when he saw David, he knew this was the one that God called. So, like through our lives, it changes. What God was saying to us when we were 20 might not be what God's saying to us when we're 40. Might be different from when we're 60. It's like an ongoing journey in that relationship with God. It's also an ongoing journey in a different way. When Jesus says here to Nathanael, you shall see greater things than these, what he's referring to is the 7 signs that are in the Gospel of St. John. The first one comes in the next verse, which is the wedding in Cana of Galilee. And the last one in the Gospel is the raising of Lazarus from the dead that leads to Jesus' execution. So all of these signs that appear in the Gospel of St. John are kind of progressive revelation of Jesus as the Messiah. He fulfills all the prophecies one by one. And I think in our lives, how we saw Jesus Christ when we were 20 is different from how we engage with Christ when we're 30 or 40 or 50. You know, as a single person, as a married person, it's like you have to learn it in a different way. How is God leading you at this time? So we can never be sure that we've already got all this figured out. It's always something new and different. It's also unfolding in history. I think part of what Jesus means when he says this in this gospel, you shall see greater things than these, is not only those signs in the gospel, but what the church would become, the people who follow Jesus Christ, how it would spread. And in particular, as I've often said, although we have shadowy chapters in church history, yet we have the founding of the hospitals, which came out of the church. We have the founding of the schools and the universities, which largely came out of not completely, but and very substantially out of the life of the church. It's as if the grace of Jesus Christ is not only in his own life, but somehow is shown through his people as well. It unfolds as we go along. So this year is still kind of in its launching phase for us as individuals. 2015 is still opening up, and it is for us as a congregation. So as individuals, and we're given these lovely readings here at the beginning of the year, let us have that spirit in us perhaps especially during this week. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Show me what your calling to me is in this year. And sometimes we may have a sort of sadness with it. As I said with Martin Luther King, he might ask what happened to the dream. But you remember he had that other speech, a great set of speeches in his life. But just before he died, it just gives me spine chills when he speaks about his coming death, that he seemed to know he was going to die. It just seems amazing. And he says in that speech that he's seen into the country that is coming, and he may not join us in it. But I think part of what the accomplishment of Jesus Christ's call to us may not necessarily be in this life, as it was for he himself. Do you remember in Gethsemane, as we have depicted there, he had his doubts about his own call, and yet he was following God's call. We saw it in his death and resurrection and in the ensuing birth of the church. So sometimes we may not see all of it in this life of ours, but we will see God's call to us perfectly fulfilled. So let us all, and now in just a moment of silence as we're going to say the creed, just open your own heart, as Samuel did, to say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening, that we may hear God's call to each of us in this year ahead. In the name of Christ, amen.